this event. First, some practical issues. We have interpretation to Spanish and French, thanks to our interpreters. You can put it on with the world icon at the bottom of your screen, as you see on this slide. You push the button and you select the language you want to use. Tenemos interpretación al español y al francés. Aprieta el icono que ve en la pantalla, como se muestra en este slide, y elija el idioma que guste usar. We ask you, please, at all times to keep your microphone muted. Por favor, mantenga su micrófono desactivado. Como último recordatorio, les recordamos que este evento va a ser grabado. Finalmente, queremos recordarles que vamos a compartir el video vía YouTube y vía social media en nuestros websites. Without more, let's start our journey. As the story goes, a group of blind people heard that a strange animal called an elephant had been brought to town, but none of them were aware of its shape and form. Out of curiosity, they said, "We must inspect it and know it." And they did so. The first person whose hand landed on the trunk said, "This being it's like a thick snake." For another whose hand reached its ear, it seemed like a kind of fang. The person who placed his hand upon the side said, "This elephant is like a wall." Another who felt its tail described it as a rope. When they discovered the disagreements, they became suspicious of each other. They thought the others are not telling the truth. This story has different endings. In one of the endings, they all defend their position and start fighting each other. In other ending, they cooperate and build a coherent concept of the whole elephant. Well, with Indigenous peoples and their rights, the topic is a bit like that big elephant, we believe. It might be that different stakeholders have a different or partial understanding of it. And when it comes to policy making, each one does its part. But the whole picture is still not coherent. This elephant is present in policymakers' rooms. It's giant, it's real, and it's one variable that could make or break the European green transition's ambition to secure raw materials. But still, it is not fully seen or recognized. Luckily, we have 9 formidable scientists and leaders today with elements to help us understand and recognize this elephant. They are joining us from everywhere in the world. We have presenters coming at 5 a.m. in the morning to 10 p.m. in the evening. Thank our speakers. The question for this event is, how can the European Union secure the supply of minerals for its twin transition by including rights holders and ensuring the respect for Indigenous peoples' rights? To start our journey, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Garina Angarova, 5 a.m. in the morning. She is the Executive Director of Cultural Survival, and she is a member of the SIRGE Coalition, the Securing Indigenous Rights in the Green Economy. Galina, you are a Buryat Indigenous leader, and you have represented Indigenous peoples and their rights in different national and international fora, including, of course, the 2030 Agenda and the climate change discussion. Thank you for being with us. We have for you 3 questions. What is the vision of Indigenous peoples for the energy transition? What is your reflection on the European Union's raw material approach to the solution of the energy crisis and to the green transition? And lastly, what do you expect from the European Union? Galina, you have the floor.
Thank you, Evelyn, for a great introduction. Samba Nakudut, this is a greeting in my native language. I come from the Abzai clan of the Inuit Nation of the Buryat peoples in Siberia. As Iblin mentioned, I serve as the Executive Director of Cultural Survival, and I also serve as the co-chair of the Executive Committee at Search Coalition. And just wanted to mention that today we're gathering on Indigenous Peoples Day in the United States. It's a big holiday. And I just wanted to say that we stand in solidarity with all of our Indigenous sisters and brothers on Turtle Island. And to answer the questions, I would start that as the green and digital transition is happening in Europe, and not only in Europe, throughout the world, at the heart of this twin transition lies a central problem. That digital, renewable energy and EV technologies are very resource intensive and require massive quantities of minerals such as lithium, copper, cobalt, nickel. Even more problematic for us is these minerals are mined on the lands and territories of Indigenous peoples globally. 54% of this mining projects that involve minerals used in these technologies are located near or on the lands of Indigenous peoples. These projects include 30-some minerals that are crucial for the production of the EV and renewable energy systems in Africa. This number, the numbers of projects rise to up to 75% in the United States. The numbers are even higher, 97% for nickel, 89% for copper, 79% for lithium, 68% for cobalt. Moreover, these minerals are mostly being extracted in countries where the rule of law is fairly weak, and there's little to no protection or regulation in place to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples. So extraction on Indigenous peoples' lands is likely to continue since these lands have high concentrations of these minerals needed for this transition. At the same time, we all know that Indigenous peoples' lands and territories span 25% of the Earth's terrestrial surface. And these lands and territories are home to 80% of the remaining biological diversity. With the world facing the multiple crises such as the climate change and the loss of biodiversity, Indigenous peoples offer solutions through their traditional knowledge and practices that protect the integrity of the landscapes and ecosystems. Therefore, it is crucial that Indigenous peoples' leadership, solutions, and knowledge are recognized, and the right to free, prior, and informed consent is activated in all stages of the so-called green transition. I also want to stress that the dominant narrative as told by mining companies and electric mobility companies that increased mining is essential for the green transition and will lead to a just transition for all should be challenged. This has not been the case for Indigenous peoples all over the world because not much changed since last century with the open pit mines and water-intensive extraction that continue to pose threats to the environment, our climate, and well-being for all people, including Indigenous people. Indigenous peoples' rights are continue being violated. Indigenous peoples continue being killed, and this time in the name of so-called green transition. And that's why we're here today to speak about minimum standards and respect for rights that are necessary to enable true and just transition for all. So for the last 2 years, our coalition, the Search Coalition, our partners in Europe, have been advocating in the European Parliament in hopes of a robust legislative approach that requires a more human rights focused and environmentally conscious framework. The reason why we think that the European Union is an important place to advocate for Indigenous peoples is because The EU is one of the largest consumer markets in the world, with 700 million consumers. And of course, the demand of this market will dictate the consequences for indigenous peoples on the ground, where the entails of the value and supply chains meet the stark realities of people affected by mining. So the approach that we have undertaken has the potential to transform the EU legal system and move the human rights and environmental due diligence processes from voluntary audits, certification, and from the area of so-called soft law to the one of legal responsibility, of legal accountability for non-compliance with the international and national law. So including references to Indigenous Peoples, International Labour Organization Convention 169, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and free, prior, and informed consent provides this opportunity for us. And regardless of the region, reforms must prioritize Indigenous peoples' rights, establish stronger environmental protections, and include mechanisms for meaningful consultation and AFPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. So we think that the EU has this unique opportunity through the Critical Raw Materials Act and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive to avoid the mistakes of the past and put Indigenous peoples' rights front and center. So finally, I would like to say that we need to challenge the dominant narrative perpetrated by the mining industry that the only way to achieve the green transition is by extracting. We need to decouple the need for increased mining from the green transition and the climate change solutions, and stop believing the mining industry's narrative that increased mining is the ultimate climate solution. A meaningful, intentional, and truly just transition will require a set of solutions, including improving existing standards, reforming old mining laws like in the United States, mandating circular regenerative practices, setting standards for reuse and recycling and meeting those standards, reducing demand, investing in innovation and new, less resource-intensive technologies, and most importantly, centering human rights and Indigenous peoples' rights, and the right to free, prior, and informed consent in all decision-making. Indigenous peoples understand the need for rethinking our energy systems and models, and it should not be done at the expense of our rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Galina. Thank you so much. I'm going to go from Galina to Kiran, who is going to bring some facts that maybe are going to support the Galina's argument. Kiran, you are going to bring the facts for us. You are in Australia. It's 10 p.m. in the evening for you. When we finish, it will be almost midnight. Thank you so much for making this effort to be with us. I have to confess that I Googled you, and I found that you have been working for more than 40 years with the 3 variables that are important for our discussion today: mining, Indigenous peoples, and policy. Your research has been cited more than 5,000 times, and you have just published a book, Indigenous Peoples and Mining, bringing all your wisdom of the last 30 years in one place. Of course, you are a rock star in the topic, and we are extremely happy to have you today with us. We have the challenge for you to summarize your wisdom in 3 points. Okay, it should go up. Okay. Kiran, why must the European Union take Indigenous peoples and their rights seriously if it wants to secure the supply of transition minerals? Second, will the recognition of Indigenous rights constitute a threat to the European Union's capacity to ensure reliable supplies of transition minerals? And third, what effect would a European Union requirement that supplies of transition minerals recognize indigenous rights might have on mining's impacts on environmental sustainability? Kieran, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm speaking to you from Brisbane in Australia. The Aboriginal name for Brisbane is Meanjin. In speaking to you tonight, I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Yagara and Turrbal Aboriginal traditional owners of the land from which I speak. I want to introduce what I think is a fairly hard-headed argument in relation to this first question of why must the European Union take Indigenous people and their rights seriously. Galina has already referred to the fact that a very high proportion of the transition minerals that are required for a shift to renewable energy are located on the lands of Indigenous peoples. 85% of potential lithium projects, 50% of copper projects, and so on. Galina quite rightly points out that we shouldn't assume that more mining is the solution, but at the same time, it is clear that whatever set of figures you use, the European Union is going to need very substantial supplies of minerals like lithium and nickel and copper. And those supplies are heavily concentrated in Indigenous territory. One of the things that has changed and that emerges very clearly from my book is that in the last 20 or 30 years, Indigenous people throughout the globe have significantly increased their capacity if their rights are ignored. And I want to emphasize this, if their rights are ignored, they have increased their capacity to delay or to stop mineral development on their territories. So there's a fundamental proposition I want to put, which is that if the European Union fails to take Indigenous rights seriously, it will threaten the European Union's capacity to secure reliable and timely supplies of transition minerals. I want to mention just a couple of examples from the book which illustrate this. One is the Tampakan project in the Philippines. This is widely regarded as the largest undeveloped copper deposit in Asia and the Pacific. It is exactly one of the sorts of deposits that will need to be mined to ensure our supply of copper. That mine was discovered 30 years ago. It has never been developed and is not being developed because the Blan traditional owners of that land, the Indigenous people who own that land, have fought a persistent campaign to stop mining because their rights were not recognized. The Philippines government tried to override their rights through the use of military power. The cost of that resistance has been high, and I don't want to minimize that. Blan people have been killed. Blan people have been tortured. They have been imprisoned, but they have stopped it. Another example is the Pascualama project in Chile, a huge project being developed by Barrick Gold, one of the biggest mining companies in the world. Resolutely opposed by the Diaguita Indigenous people starting almost 20 years ago. In 2021, Barrick finally abandoned that project, walked away from an investment of $5.1 billion because the Diaguita, in combination with their allies in civil society, had used litigation in national and international courts, had used direct action, had used political lobbying, had allied with sympathetic elements of the Chilean state, and there are some elements in states in many parts of the world that can be mobilized in support of Indigenous people. And again, they stopped that project. Even if it's not possible to stop projects, Indigenous people more and more are able to delay them. And one of the critical issues for the European Union is that it simply cannot afford widespread delays in development of transition minerals. Because if those delays happen, the sort of timeframes that the European Union has set itself for the transition can't be achieved. So my answer to the first question is that the European Union simply must take Indigenous rights seriously, because if they don't, their capacity to ensure reliable and timely supplies of minerals will be threatened. That is not an outcome that is going to be favorable to the European Union. It's not an outcome that's going to be favorable to Indigenous people, especially if they are wrongly blamed for standing up for those rights. My second question is, will recognition of Indigenous rights constitute a threat to the European Union's capacity to ensure reliable supplies? This is one of the arguments that is put up against recognition of Indigenous rights. If we recognize Indigenous rights, they will basically close mining down. They will stop it, and we won't be able to make the transition. There will certainly be some specific cases where mining projects pose such a severe threat to environmental and cultural values that Indigenous people will feel they simply cannot permit it to happen because it threatens their identity and their survival. However, my book shows that in many cases, opposition to mining frequently develops because of a failure to recognize rights. That's where the opposition starts, especially the failure to allow Indigenous people to control development on their territory. And that's why we will talk later on about free, prior and informed consent. But the bottom line with free, prior and informed consent is that it allows Indigenous people to control development. Once people are put in a position where they can control development, there are many examples in different parts of the world where Indigenous people have negotiated agreements that allow mining to go ahead. In many cases, Indigenous people are keen to secure the economic opportunities that mineral development can bring, but at the same time, they are determined to protect their lands, to protect their culture. Only recognition of their rights allow that balance to be achieved. But once it is achieved, it is possible for mineral development to proceed. One example just of many I could use to illustrate that. In Australia's Northern Territory, the only place in Australia where free, prior and informed consent is a reality. On Aboriginal freehold land, Aboriginal traditional owners effectively have a veto over mineral development. This has not resulted in a collapse of mineral exploration. It has not resulted in a failure to develop minerals. As we speak, the many parts of the Northern Territory are seeing very high level of activity in relation to transition minerals. It is certainly the case that in many of those instances, Aboriginal people have used their veto to say to miners, you have applied for a particular area. There are parts of that where you cannot go. There are parts of that where you cannot go within 10 or 20 kilometers of. But once they're in a position to insist on those conditions, development does happen and can happen and is happening and can happen in the future. The third question I've been asked to address is, what effect would the European Union requirement that supplies of transitional minerals recognise Indigenous rights have on mining's impact on environmental sustainability? Indigenous peoples have a fundamental commitment to ecological and cultural sustainability because it's essential to their identity and their survival. If their rights are recognised, they often become involved in managing mining projects to ensure that their impact on sustainability is minimized, their negative impact on sustainability is minimized, and that in some cases, the opportunities created by mining and by mining revenues are used to actually contribute to sustainability. You can see this very clearly if you look at the agreements that have been negotiated by traditional owners, by Indigenous peoples in Australia and Canada. I'll just mention a couple of examples. One is the Voisey's Bay Nickel Project, which is on the lands of Innu and Inuit people in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada. The Innu and Inuit negotiated agreements, binding contractual agreements, under which a nickel project at Voisey's Bay proceeded at a third of the scale that the developer and the Newfoundland government wanted. This had a fundamental influence on the environmental footprint of the project. It provided a much longer time frame in which to develop social and economic opportunities from the project, and so enhanced its social sustainability. Those agreements also have strict conditions in relation to shipping through sea ice, which helps minimize, again, the environmental footprint, but also helps to preserve the livelihood of Inuit people who depend heavily on seal hunting. In Aboriginal Australia, a number of groups have used revenues from mining to establish Aboriginal ranger programs. These are much more wide-ranging in their effects, go way beyond the issue of the impact of mining, because these Aboriginal ranger programs have been critical in reintroducing, for example, traditional burning methods, cool burning, which very substantially minimizes the impacts of fires on the amount of carbon that's released into the atmosphere, and so on climate change. Those Aboriginal ranger programs are also working on protecting habitat for vulnerable species, dealing with invasive weeds. They make a contribution that goes way beyond the mining sector. Also, recognition of Indigenous rights can minimize the possibility that mining will have catastrophic effects on Indigenous cultural heritage. For example, in May 2021, Rio Tinto Iron Ore destroyed a rock shelter that was 45,000 years old. Not just part of Aboriginal heritage, a part of the world's heritage, part of the heritage of humankind. If Aboriginal people were in control, if their rights were properly recognized, that would not have happened. In summary, recognition of Indigenous rights can help secure a reliable supplies of traditional minerals for the European Union. It will not threaten those supplies if Indigenous rights are fully recognized. And it will contribute to environmental and cultural sustainability and ways that will benefit the citizens of the European Union, but also the whole of humankind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderfully clear, and thank you so much for bringing the role of Indigenous peoples in a systemic perspective, building this whole elephant. It's not only mining for the energy transition, but it's actually keeping our planet running. Thank you, Kiran. From Kiran, we go more to the ground with I'm going to share my screen again, and we go to, no, this is not right. Sorry. We go now to Carolina Van. Carolina Van has been working with the following mining companies. And we have invited her because actually one active policymaker commented to us that we need not to demonize mining because we need minerals for the transition. And we agree. That's of course true. But we must not see mining through pink and green glasses either. What we need is to look at the facts. Caroline has been doing this for the last years. Caroline, welcome. You have a tracker that has been following the transition minerals companies' behaviors and compliance with human rights for the last few years from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. You are a senior researcher and you have the facts in your hands. Could you please help us to see what is the reality of the ground? We have 3 questions for you. What are the major findings of from your organization, Business and Human Rights Resource Center, on the ground? Do mining companies have policies and procedures in place to guarantee the respect of Indigenous peoples' rights? And related to this, and very much with the discussion at the European level about self-regulation and certification schemes, will voluntary self-regulation measure schemes suffice to guarantee respect for Indigenous peoples' rights on the ground? And lastly, can you bring a good example from the ground? Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Evelyn, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm gonna share my screen now. Yeah, let me just... Okay. All right. Okay, so hi everyone. So my name is Caroline and I'm a senior researcher at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So we are an international human rights organization. We've been dedicated to advancing human rights in business. And in recent years, we have been looking more specifically and researching and publishing briefings, looking at the rights of communities seeking responsible natural resources use in a just energy transition and what we can call an or not a just energy transition. So today what I'm going to do is present what we know from the findings of our transition minerals tracker, which is a global analysis tool of human rights in the energy transition, looking specifically at allegations of human rights abuses connected with mining for 6 minerals that are key in the energy transition and also are key to and central to the European Critical Raw Materials Act. So we launched the Transition Mineral Tracker in 2019. Last year, we launched the 3rd edition. So the tracker records allegations of human rights abuses connected with 6 key minerals, as I was saying. So those are copper, lithium, manganese, nickel, and zinc. What we do is that we focus on the largest producing mines and we attempt to cover a market majority of producers in each of those key 6 minerals. So we have a data set of 172 mines that we monitor and we record abuses across 6 different categories, which are environmental impacts, impact on communities, impact on workers, governance and transparency related impacts, security related impacts, and also COVID-19. This has been mentioned by speakers before me, but we already know that a significant proportion of transition minerals projects are located on or near indigenous territories. So what we know from our research is that given the types of risk of human rights harms that are associated with minings, those can be mining can really exacerbate existing insecurities in indigenous territories and especially land-related conflicts. We now have collected for the period from 2010 to 2022 more than 500 cases of allegations of human rights abuses, which account for more than 1,500 impacts. So one case is related to, on average, 3 impacts. The leading category of abuse is abuse against local communities in general, civil society organizations and their leaders, accounting for nearly 2/3 of all the allegations. And so among which we have 49 cases of allegations of abuses of indigenous rights, including 25 of disrespect of either the right to FPIC and or land rights. I'm going to go into this in a minute, but it is important to remember that those figures are very much the tip of the iceberg because we rely on public sources, including local media and NGO reports. And so, of course, in context of severe civic space restrictions, it is likely that main issues remain, unfortunately, unreported. So, as I said, we have in total 500 allegations of human rights abuses, among which we have about 133 cases of attacks against human rights defenders, and a third of those are attacks against against indigenous defenders. And so what we include in attacks are repression of the right to peaceful protest, cases of judicial harassment, including arrest, arbitrary detention, but also strategic lawsuits against public participation, intimidation, and threats, as well as killings. So this is unfortunately unsurprising, as we already knew that mining is the most dangerous sector for defenders, according to our own database of attacks against human rights defenders. What we know is that approximately 1/3 of attacks against human rights defenders and related to transition minerals, as I was saying, are against indigenous peoples. And indigenous defenders pay a disproportionate price to the protection of climate, land, and forest. It's also important to remember that such attacks on human rights defenders are definitely not standalone events. What we see from our research is that there is a continuum between affected rights holders, affected rights, and attacks against those defending them, and particularly in relation to the rights of indigenous people to give free, prior, and informed consent to the exploitation of their resources and lands over which they often don't have secure tenure. Those attacks often aim at suppressing their voices and delegitimizing their asks. When indigenous communities experience a lack of inclusive community consultation and robust implementation of their right to FPIC, they understandably push back against projects they see as responsible and imposed on their territories and their lands, and in turn are silenced through judicial harassment, threats, physical attacks, and sometimes even murders. And we have recorded 7 cases of killings of indigenous defenders since 2010, 2 in Peru around the Las Bambas project, 3 in the Philippines, 2 in Guatemala. Sorry. So on this slide, what you can see is an overview, a very general overview of where those 49 cases have been taking place. As you can see, they range across all continents, but Latin America features more prominently. So the number one case, the number one mine in terms of number of allegations is the Phoenix mine in Guatemala, which is a nickel mine. And then Cerro Matoso in Colombia and Las Bambas in Peru. And all this data is publicly available on our website. So just to say a few words on emblematic cases and also very much echoing what has been said by Kiran. What we see is that when indigenous communities feel that they have not been respected, that their rights have not been respected, this causes conflict dynamics, which then sometimes even fuel existing conflict dynamics and reinforce them. Nornickel in Russia has been the subject of serious concerns about the company's damages to territories and livelihoods of indigenous peoples in the Arctic, in Russian Arctic for many years. Tesla was urged by 72 groups to stop procuring nickel. We supported this effort in reaching out to companies which never responded. Las Bambas in Peru, this is the mine that is associated with the highest count of allegations of human rights abuses in our own tracker. And has been linked to serious oppositions and lasting conflict for many years. Guatemala, again, like the Phoenix El Estor mine, despite lasting oppositions and violent repression of protests following reported failure to secure FPIC, the mine has continued to operate. So just to summarize what we know also from companies' policy. So what we know is that the impact of the global climate crisis are multiplying quickly, and particularly for indigenous and marginalized communities. But the transition cannot come at their expense. When rights are not respected, the transition cannot be fast because it will not be fair. And the alternative is abuse, distrust, delay, and cost, as was already mentioned. So basic respect for human and environmental rights, which really centers the right to participation and consent of indigenous groups and local communities and workers as well, should be a fundamental first steps for all mining companies to achieve or contribute to the objectives of a just and sustainable energy transition. Unfortunately, what we see today is that less than half of the companies that are associated with allegations in our last edition of our tracker have human rights policies in place. And that does not even say whether those policies are actually effectively implemented or not. I also want to mention that last month, our friends at Oxfam published a very much needed and timely analysis of the FPIC policies of the world's largest mining companies. And the results, which you can see on these slides, are pretty appalling, show that there is considerable room for improvement in the sector, starting at policy level, with only 2 companies having adopted a complete commitment to respect FPIC. So this answers, I think, one of your questions, Evelyn. Clearly, we see a need for legislations to mandate respect for indigenous rights, and in particular for FPIC, as voluntary measures and voluntary policies by companies are insufficient at this moment in time. And so, lastly, just to finish on looking at potential avenues for positive developments. So we know that the right to FPIC implies that there is a right to say no to mining operations. But when indigenous groups choose to give consent to mining projects, community equity models can offer an important avenue to ensure full respect of their rights. So in such models, indigenous groups may co-own own equity shares and or co-manage mining operations. There are barriers to overcome in such models, such as accessing financial capitals. However, and they have been now tested in a few areas, we see that such models can help indigenous groups secure financial benefits from mining projects. So calls have been made in Peru by one group living near the Las Bambas mine, and in Australia, where Aboriginal groups in the Yukon area are moving to co-managing or reported to move to co-managing iron ore mining operations of Rio Tinto. So such models can give maybe a real seat at the table to indigenous groups, but implementing them requires mining companies to move away from considering them as stakeholders that need to be consulted only, and rather see them as full actors of projects. Thank you. I will keep it to that.
Yes, thank you, Caroline. Thank you. So if we are clear that certification schemes will not do the work, and actually we need a strong legislation, European legislation in this case. And the question is our legislation fit for purpose? Unfortunately, we have here with us Tabea Willie. Tabea Willie is a specialist in legal issues, and she has studied the European legislations from front to back and from back to forth. The question for you, Tabea, is: which are the key European legislation pieces related to indigenous peoples in the green transition that we need to consider? Second question: what are the good, the bad, and the ugly elements in the European legislation when we focus on indigenous peoples? And third question, what should the European legislation look like to do the job of ensuring Indigenous people's rights and increasing the odds of securing the raw materials for the EU transition as the European Union wants? Tabea, the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, good morning, afternoon, or night to everybody. I'm also going to share my screen. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm from the Society for Threatened Peoples. We are a human rights organization advocating for the rights of Indigenous peoples and minorities, and we are based in Bern, Switzerland. Yeah, so as we heard from the previous speakers, the legal developments around the green transition in the EU is highly relevant for Indigenous peoples. And in the last couple of months, there has been tremendous efforts from the EU to develop legislation in the context of the green transition. In my presentation, I will try to briefly explain the opportunities and the threats of these legislations for Indigenous peoples. So basically, there are three relevant legislations in this context. There's the EU battery regulation, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, and the Critical Raw Material Act. As the CSDDD and the Critical Raw Material Act are now in a really decisive phase, I will focus on these two legislative proposals. And I will start with the CSDDD. The goal of the CSDDD is to mandate companies to implement due diligence procedures to mitigate their adverse impacts on human rights and the environment throughout their global value chains, while promoting responsible and sustainable corporate practices. The CSDDD offers significant opportunities for Indigenous people's rights. It has the potential to pave the way for more corporate accountability, for more responsible business conduct, and more access to justice for Indigenous peoples. But to achieve this, the CSDDD needs to include international law regarding Indigenous peoples' rights, and most crucially, the right to free, prior, and informed consent. The CSDDD really offers the opportunity to codify the right to free, prior, and informed consent into binding law. And through this, the legislative proposal has gives the EU the opportunity to lead by example for other countries or regions. And so the question is, the CSDDD currently on a good track regarding Indigenous people's rights? So I will first start with a short analysis on the Commission's proposal. One important key element is the human rights due diligence. And in its obligations for human rights due diligence, the Commission included a reference to Indigenous people's land rights as enshrined in the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. It also included UNDRIP and the International Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination to the list of international instruments that need to be respected, however, only under certain circumstances. This leads me to the downsides. There is a problematic two-tiered approach in the due diligence requirements, as only certain segments of rights are mandatory and the other segments of international instruments only apply under certain circumstances. And further, the right to FPIC is missing, and there is no reference to the important instrument for Indigenous people's rights, the ILO Convention 169. And regarding stakeholder consultation, the Commission's proposal requires the stakeholder consultation, but only where relevant, and also there, the right of Indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent is missing. There are other really important shortcomings that I unfortunately don't have time to elaborate, but the scope of companies is limited, and also the value chain scope is limited in a problematic way. As the next step, I will explain briefly the European Parliament's amendments. The Parliament really made some favorable amendments to the proposal of the Commission. And concerning the obligation for human rights due diligence, the Parliament added a direct affirmation of the right to self-determination of Indigenous peoples, and it included ILO Convention 169. However, there is still a lack of direct reference to free, prior, and informed consent as enumerated in the UNDRIP. Regarding stakeholder consultation, the Parliament defined vulnerable stakeholders as encompassing Indigenous peoples, and it also established that meaningful engagement with Indigenous peoples is necessary while respecting the UNDRIP. But also there is no specific reference to the right to FPIC. Then the Parliament also made very favorable amendments regarding the scope of companies and also the value chain scope. So to conclude, what's really paramount is that the right to self-determination and the right to FPIC of Indigenous peoples must be included into the human rights due diligence requirements for companies. And a strong reference to FPIC as enumerated in the UNDRIP must be included. And ILO 169 and regional human rights instruments need to be included. Regarding stakeholder consultation, the Parliament made a really favorable amendment, but also there, the right to FPIC must be included. Regarding the value chain scope, as mentioned, it's very favorable that the Parliament extended the scope regarding the companies, but also regarding the value chain affected. Now we're going to look into the second proposal, the Critical Raw Material Act. Here, the relevance for Indigenous peoples are basically twofold. The Critical Raw Material Act sets specific benchmarks for EU internal production of raw materials for the green transition. And this increases pressure on Indigenous communities in Europe. And secondly, by establishing strategic partnerships with third countries, the EU risks perpetuating unfair and unjust structures with material-rich regions. So let's look at the Commission's proposal of the Critical Raw Material Act. As discussed or as mentioned before, one of the core elements of the Critical Raw Material Act are these strategic projects, and these projects need to fulfill certain sustainability requirements. However, these requirements are really weak in the Commission's proposal, and they do not entail the right to FPIC. References to UNDRIP and to ILO Convention 169 are missing, and there is a reference to the CSDDD. However, the scope of the CSDDD is still unclear, so this is a shaky reference. And there are also problematic formulations in the proposal, such as the requirement for establishing plans containing measures to facilitating public acceptance. this formulation could be read even counter to FPIC, and also the formulation of projects of overriding public interest. So I want to come back to the sustainability requirements and really highlight a significant loophole of these requirements. So companies can either comply with these listed sustainability requirements, or alternatively, they can just rely on certification or simply commit to obtain certification. This is a highly problematic approach because there is a big lack of transparency, and these certification schemes are mainly self-regulated. Just recently, the Parliament has made its amendment to the proposal, and very importantly, the Parliament added the right to FPIC as enumerated in UNRIP to the sustainability requirements of strategic projects. However, there is still no requirement for FPIC in the certification scheme. And this systematic loophole with the reliance on certification that I just explained remains. To conclude for the Critical Raw Material Act, it's really paramount that the provisions of the Critical Raw Material Act do not undermine the rights that are protected or will be protected under the CSDDD. This also to ensure policy coherence within the EU. And strategic projects under the Critical Raw Material Act need to undergo a due diligence process without the possibility to evade this via certification. Or as a minimum, the right to free, prior and informed consent must be included into the certification scheme's requirements. The problematic wordings that I mentioned, such as overriding public interest and facilitating public acceptance, need to be removed. And last but not least, for strategic partnerships, clear defined criteria for mutual benefits are needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we need from you, we hear from you and from all our speakers that the rights of indigenous peoples need to be protected, and they are not protected in the actual, in the current situation and in the current proposal in the European legislation. And we have talked a lot about free, prior and informed consent, but this free, prior and informed consent is not always understood. But of course, we have a specialist on this. I'm going to share my screen to give the word to Kate Finn. Kate, you are a leader, you are Osage, and you are indigenous leader already some time. You are also the executive director of First Peoples Worldwide. And in your work, you focus on articulating, on one hand, respect for indigenous people's rights and business, and the other hand, business operations. And we have 3 questions for you, specifically regarding the free, prior, and informed consent. You are going to help us to know the what and the why. The first question for you, what is free, prior, and informed consent really? And we know you have launched, you are launching today the FPIC protocol, the first of its kind for the people, prepared by indigenous people, for indigenous peoples. Please give us a word on this. Then the second question for you is, how does FPIC relate to the European twin transition, and how it could enable the supply of raw materials in a just and sustainable way, respecting indigenous people's rights? And the third question for you is, how does FPIC could relate to social license to operate? And why is it important for governments and companies. This is very important because we have heard from some MEPs that FPIC should be only followed by governments and or by companies, and there is a lot of misunderstanding. Please let us know who has to follow FPIC, how they have to do it, and bring us some light on this point. Kate, you have the word.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, and thank you to all of these wonderful presenters who are helping us to understand all of these points as it relates to the green transition. Let me here very quickly share my slides so that we can continue on this presentation. Yes, I think I'm there now, yes, with the slides. So thank you very much for having me. I am the Executive Director of First Peoples Worldwide and a co-chair of the Surge Coalition. We've heard a lot today about free, prior, and informed consent, and I want to shed a little bit of light on why. Why FPIC? Why is this so important to Indigenous peoples? And why is it important that we pay special attention to FPIC when we think about the green economy and this transition coming up? So what I want to start with is this, that in terms of Indigenous peoples, free, prior, and informed consent is best considered when it's considered from the perspective of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Of course, the UN Declaration is soft law, it is non-binding, but it is also the universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. And when free, prior, and informed consent is upheld to the level of the Declaration, it is doing its best work. It is there for the protection of Indigenous peoples' self-determination over all of their rights. It is the rights that are included in terms of their lands, territories, and resources. It's also rights to care for our children. It's rights to our intellectual property. And on this, in the United States, on Indigenous Peoples Day, we are celebrating the incredible cultures and fabric of languages that we have as Indigenous peoples. So I want to be very clear that even though the UN Declaration is not mandatory law in many countries, it is the highest standard. And when any company, when any external entity goes into an Indigenous community to talk about what development could look like, including mining, this is the standard that Indigenous peoples are expecting. This is the standard that, that they seek to have upheld. I'll say here, so why is FPIC important for Indigenous peoples? When it is done right, it is grounded in sovereignty and self-determination. It upholds Indigenous peoples' rights. We know that through colonization, the lands, territories, and resources of Indigenous peoples have not been adequately considered by nation states, nor have they been adequately considered by corporations. And this is what has led to incredible human rights abuses, as Caroline has let us know, and has led to loss of land and life. And so FPIC is a mechanism to safeguard those rights. When done well, free, prior, and informed consent provides equity in decision-making and participation as to development that impacts Indigenous peoples and their resources. And FPIC, again, is supported throughout the Declaration, as it is in ILO 169. But it is a mechanism, it is a way to bring Indigenous peoples into the conversation in a way that is equitable and in a way that supports their decision-making. I want to be very clear too about what rights-based standards are for free, prior, and informed consent. We know that many companies, many standard-setting organizations, many actors in the private sector have put forth their own vision for free, prior, and informed consent. But in fact, we again will hold free, prior, and informed consent to the standard in the Declaration so that it upholds self-determination of Indigenous peoples and not just the agenda of companies or the private sector. Just a couple of elements here. Consultation and consent are different. What we seek is full consent, but consultation is a process to achieve consent. It's a process to understand what the priorities of the Indigenous leaders are, what their priorities are in their lands, territories, and resources, what their negotiating power could be, what they want, what their priorities are. But consultation is not a single moment of contact. It is not just a letter or a public hearing. Consultation is a process of dialogue. It is a process over the entire course of a project that can include design, management, it can include development in itself. But FPIC is a process, and it is a right to say yes, no, or maybe. And that leads to my last point, that full consent. Consent can be full consent, a full yes. And there are so many equitable deals being done around the world with Indigenous peoples. Particularly, there's examples in Canada with First Nations there, and several examples in Australia as well, where there are equitable deals being done where Indigenous peoples are leading to develop projects. There's conditional consent, and there's also refusal of consent. All of these are consent, and it will allow Indigenous peoples to have full control of their land, and it will allow the private sector to understand what the priorities are before they enter that land. I want to say here too that for companies, of course, social license to operate is imperative. And as companies in the EU are looking to develop materials and to develop partnerships around the world, they must have social license to operate. In fact, we know that one of the top 10 business risks facing mining and metals is license to operate. In 2023, it was the number 4 risk. For Indigenous peoples, gaining free, prior, and informed consent is social license to operate. In fact, without free, prior, and informed consent, there is no social license to operate. And as Kieran was noting before, Indigenous peoples have incredible power to delay projects, to ensure that there could be material and reputational damages to a company should social license to operate not be secured in a rights-based manner. We did a study a number of years ago at First Peoples Worldwide that looked at the Dakota Access Pipeline controversy that occurred in the United States in 2016 and 2017. Needless to say, that company put in a pipeline without the free, prior, and informed consent of the tribe or several of the tribes affected. And what we found is that the company had said that the project would cost $3.4 billion, but in total, it cost at least 7.5, at least double, because they failed to receive free, prior, and informed consent. And we watched the stock market during the time of the controversy, and the company's stock declined by 20% during that time. But the stock market itself increased by 35%. There was a real material impact to the company when they did not secure the free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples. And we know that community disruptions can cost mining projects $20 to $30 million a week should social license to operate not be confirmed. I also want to say that operationalizing free, prior, and informed consent can assist companies to identify risks, to identify operational risks, to identify social risks, and to prevent those risks that stem from social conflict and that stem from human rights violations. We know that Indigenous peoples around the world are affected, and so including free, prior, and informed consent in legislation is imperative to ensure that due diligence is conducted to the highest level, to ensure that decision making is understood by and for Indigenous peoples. I want to say here too that, as I said before, Indigenous peoples are on the land where these minerals are, and Indigenous peoples' priorities are as varied as the Indigenous peoples around the world. We have over 6,000 entities, Indigenous entities around the world. Including free, prior, and informed consent allows the private sector to understand each of those priorities. It allows the private sector to come to good and equitable deals when Indigenous peoples are able to come to the table in a way that is free and fair. So with that, I will turn the conversation back over to you, Evelyn, and I am glad to be here to share any more information on free, prior, and informed consent.
Thank you so much, Kate. From you, I'm going to go directly with FPIC on the ground, and I'm going to call Edson. I'm going to share my screen to present Edson. Edson. Edson is a CRENAC leader from Brazil. Edson, you're an advocacy officer at Cultural Survival, and you spent half of your time with Indigenous peoples communities on the ground, and the other half meeting policymakers and other stakeholders at national and international levels. I would like you to reflect on what Kate just said and answer 3 questions. Could you paint the picture on how the situation of mining and the transition and FPIC is on the global south? What is the perception you see from policymakers and the industry regarding FPIC on the ground? And third, could you provide examples of FPIC processes on the ground? Edson, the word is yours.
Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you for having me in this really very instructive and important, now I can use the word critical conference on this topic. I would like to share my screen here before I start dealing with the questions. Yes, I believe it's right. Yeah, okay. Well, because we also are minding the time, I could initially saying that answering your first question by saying that there is a colonial line that is not only timeline that comes from the 19th century, the 16th century to these days we are living. This line is also geographical line. That the term global south or global north doesn't really actually encapsulates or represents the sufferings, the challenges that Indigenous people suffer everywhere in the world, not only in the global south, but also in Europe. We have seen in the chat, like our relatives from Sami people sharing their same experiences related to this colonial mindset that comes from the 19th century, but also is drawing a stream or flowing a stream of violence, environmental destruction, river contamination, human rights violation, livelihoods destroyed, and so many problems. This is the situation that we have seen the mining, the context of mining, not only my country in Brazil, in my people and relatives in the state of Minas Gerais, but unfortunately, where in a so-called global mining, global south, from Asia, Africa, continent, Latin America, and many parts in the so-called global north, the mining activity is also surrounded by extreme poverty. Does it bring anything to the people and also to the environment in there? But I would like to share, I will mind the time, 2 topics in my presentation. First, the experience that I know that is not unique in Brazil, but shows how Indigenous peoples in Brazil are seen in the FPIC, the Free, Prior, Informed Consent, the protocol, the experience of protocols. And you can see my image, this beautiful image here is just being launched now, the FPIC guide that Surge coalitions, especially Cultural Survival and Indigenous People Worldwide has launched this week, very fresh, very new guide for Indigenous people to learn how they can use these rights, because we know that FPIC doesn't give any rights, recognize the right of Indigenous people have to say yes, no, or yes with conditions. And in Brazil, Indigenous peoples have not failed to understand the FPIC. That's why they are producing, Indigenous peoples, Quilombola peoples are producing those protocols, the rules, the guidelines, the orientation to states and companies to conduce the process of consultation, of negotiation, dialogue, to one day have the final consent of yes, no, or yes with conditions. Then these protocols, I would love to talk about several of them. We have many, but they shows they are autonomous protocols, this kind of internal document that Indigenous peoples produce to guide the companies and the states. There are several types of protocols, but they share consultation plans. They share actually the Indigenous people's imagination of a better world for them. Is not only for them, but for the entire planet. Because the goal of Indigenous people is also the same goal, to tackle climate change, to protect the environment. But unfortunately, what we are seeing is the mining sector, the European countries are failing this imagination of a better world for everyone. And that's why I will skip some slides. I apologize for that. It's just sharing here some how the protocols are built, what they have, how the Indigenous people are conducting them. And then I go to the second part of my presentation. That is, I would like to share a critical, very brief analysis from two perspectives that we have on our experience from the ground. And I will use as a context the state of Minas Gerais. I will use the context as the lithium mining, the new operations in the valley, the Jequitinhonha Valley in the southeast of Brazil. That we know that there is a narrative about preventing climate change, tackling fossil fuels, etc., related to that. But we also see that the states are aligned with the corporations. And that's why the experience of Indigenous people has been like not really so positive with FPIC, because the state is not really respecting the FPIC process among Indigenous peoples, the right of Indigenous peoples. In the corporations, they are doing even worse. They are completely ignoring these rights, ignoring the Indigenous people's voices. And then we see here these images, example of state governments, the local authorities going to US with corporation representatives to sell the lithium there. We see on the other picture, I will share many pictures. Unfortunately, I will not comment on all of them, but Sigma Lithium Corporation that is clearly showing or clearly advertise that they practice what they call sustainable mining. We don't know exactly what that means, but from their perspective is a utilitarian perspective. They no, we have a goal, we are going to do anything to achieve this goal. From Indigenous peoples, we have another perspective that is ethics of affection and care perspective of the environment. We can achieve the same goal without destroying the environment. We can work to prevent climate change get worse, tackle fossil fuels, etc., but with a different perspective. And then I can share some voices, some differences from this perspective. For example, the Sigma Lithium CEO, she her company has like has shares from countries in Europe, in many countries. She's selling this idea of sustainable production. But when we see what is going on the ground, in a company that didn't respect Indigenous people's right to consultation, to consent, the state was not on the side of Indigenous peoples, the local authority is not on the side of Indigenous people. We see the experience. We just went there with Cultural Survival Team in July. They tell us how many impacts they already suffering. We see on the screen Cleonice Pancararu sharing about the disturbance of in the environment, the animals that they never seen in the community now invading the community, threatening their lives. Lack of water, so many problems they are facing because of the presence of this so-called sustainable mining there. And these two perspectives, they in somehow they undermine the ethic process, because from one side, the state and companies, they wanted to commodify everything. They wanted to focus on consumption and production more and more of goods. What they want, they sell is the happiness. We want to satisfy this need of never-ending consumption. They focus on individualization. They focus on property, ownership, possession, profits. But on the other side, when Indigenous peoples, they come to the consultation, what we want is to share and respect what is priceless in our life. We wanted to look at the environment, our protocols, they aim to care and to protect the environment. We wanted to share love over happiness. We are considering community life, democracy of species. We consider important also to protect not only Indigenous peoples, but also animals, plants, trees. We focus on communality, relationship. This clash of two perspectives, what we are seeing in Brazil, leads to a kind of a politicization of the justice, when we see politicians try to undermine and not respect the rights of Indigenous peoples. We are facing the battle over the topic called marco temporal, the temporal frame, that I believe everyone is familiar with. I don't have time to elaborate on that, but we also see the judicialization of politics in a more local level, where politicians and the mining corporations, they corrupt the system to undermine the rights of Indigenous people. What is going on there? I'm going to share some pictures from the mining in the Jequitinhonha Valley, and also on the right side, on your left side, the pictures from the Indigenous communities, where they live, what they have there, and the situation that we can clearly see the difference between this so-called sustainable mining and the lives of Indigenous peoples. The biggest challenge now, once the mining, the lithium mines are already present there, one part of the territory that is very close, 5-10 kilometers from Indigenous lands, they are already impacted. What the Indigenous peoples and some local communities, they want to protect one area called Chapada do Lagoão. It's kind of a plateau that's where they found there's not only the sacred place of these people, but also there is only the one of the unique water source for them in an area that is semi-arid. It's almost like a savanna desert over there. They need this to protect that. They conduct some consultations. Yeah, I'm already going to the conclusion. They conduct some consultations, because you can see here circles. The two circles showed the first one on top is where the minings already are, and the bottom where the prospection, the studies from the Sigma, by Atlas and other mining corporations are aiming to start, but people are trying to prevent that. Then they conduct some consultations and they get like part of the Justice Department and part of the local, the civil society on their side. They said no to open new mines near the Chapada do Lagoão. The justice was able to prevent that happening. Then the studies were paused. Then we can see that is a kind of a victory for the local people, indigenous people there to protect the plateau. But what's happening there, unfortunately, those companies are still around this place to conduct their studies without any consultation, without any respect on indigenous people's rights. And what I wanted to highlight, that indigenous peoples in Brazil or in many other countries we have been visiting or talking or getting to know what the FPIC process, the indigenous peoples are ready to talk about that, because we have a very clear view about what the consultation is. I share here at the end from Vanessa Corab, Munduruku, and Davi Copenau Yanomami, what they think the FPIC protocol or FPIC process is. The Munduruku people have a consultation protocol. We wanted to guide you how to come to us and talk to us, because you should respect the law, because no government wants to respect us under the Constitutional Convention 169. We ourselves made our own laws that serve for the white man, Alessandra states. Then Davi Copenau, he strongly describes the FPIC, the protocol is our weapon, our instrument to defend ourselves, the consultation protocol. Sawe, thank you very much.
Edson, thank you for all that passion bringing the what is happening on the ground in Brazil. And we immediately go to what is happening in Sweden. As you rightly said, the problems of indigenous peoples are everywhere the same. And that's exactly what we are going to hear from Arne Müller. He's a Swedish journalist and author. And he could not be with us today, but we have recorded his presentation. Agnes, please, could you go on with the video? Agnes?
Yes, sharing 1 second.
Yeah. Arne, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us. You're in Sweden, and Sweden is, of course, considered as one of the countries with the highest potentials in Europe to provide the minerals for the European green transition. And most of the minerals reserves are, of course, in the north, where we find also the Sami indigenous peoples. Arne, could you please tell us how the situation is on the ground?
Well, yes, it's true that Sweden, and mainly northern Sweden, is an important region for mining in Europe. We have the big iron ore mines around Kiruna and Gällivare, and then in the Skellefteå area we have several mines producing copper, zinc, lead, and also gold. And on the surface it looks like not so much has been happening in mining in Sweden. The number of mines is about the same as it was 20 years ago. But that's not the whole truth, because production has increased sharply, almost doubled from 47 million tons to 87 million tons. And one of the main reasons I will show you now, this is the Aitik mine. It's owned by Boliden. It's 3.5 kilometers long, 1.2 kilometers wide, and 550 meters deep. Every year it produces more than 40 million tons of ore. And the grade is quite low. It's 0.2% copper in this ore. And I show the picture because it's quite typical of the trend in mining in Sweden and also internationally, because as the grade of metals becomes lower, it's almost necessary to have an open pit mine, but because of economic reasons. And if you are going to have a viable production in this kind of low grade ores, you have to produce in a large scale. So we see several of the new mining projects in Sweden look like quite similar to this specific mine. What we also can see is that the interest for starting new mines is increasing, has been increasing over the last couple of years. We see this in the costs of exploration. Yeah, we see this in, for example, the costs for exploration, which has been increasing very fast over the last couple of years. It's almost 3 times as high as it was 10 years ago. And there are also now about 15 advanced projects for new mines, especially in the north. And most of them are in some way connected to the green transition. Yeah, for example, there is the Australian company Talga, which is planning for 4 graphite mines close to the village of Vittangi. Then we have a number of copper mines that are being planned. The biggest one is Boliden's Laver project, which is almost a copy of the Aitik mine. So a very big open pit mine. And then finally we have the Rönnbäcken project, which is a nickel cobalt mine. And also this is a large open pit mine. Actually 3 open pits mines are being planned, which cover an area as big as the central parts of Stockholm. So we can see that now there are plans for a quite rapid expansion of mining in northern Sweden, and almost all of these projects come into conflict with Sami reindeer herding. For example, these plans for graphite mines close to Vittangi, they will almost cut off a big part of the winter grazing land of a Sami village called Palma, and also affect the 2 neighboring Sami villages. Here we see the chairman of the Saarivuoma Sami village looking at the test mining of graphite, which has been done in this area. We also see it in an iron ore project called Kallak, where the ore is the plan is to transport the ore on lorries, about 100 lorries every day, and the road along which this ore is going to be transported goes along a narrow stretch where the reindeers of the Jokokaska Sami village are moving every spring and every autumn between the mountain region and the forest region. So these are 2 examples, but actually in most of the new mining projects, we see these kind of conflicts between Sami reindeer herding and mining.
And Arne, we have seen the importance of the pre-prior and informed consent to include indigenous peoples, and I see conflicts here already. How is FPIC being respected in Sweden?
Well, it's hard to say that is the case, and that's not what I am saying, but actually there has been some research done in this field at the Department of Law at the University of Luleå, and they made one report looking closer at the Swedish legislation, and the conclusion was that Swedish legislation does not really include free and prior informed consent. And they also made a study where they compared the legislation and the practical implementation of the legislation in Sweden and Canada. And the result in that report was that actually given bigger consideration of the rights of indigenous
dio una
people
consideración de los
in
derechos de los pueblos
Canadian law
indígenas.
than in Swedish law.
En
Okay.
derechos.
Arne, could you give us an example of free, prior, and informed consent of the involvement of indigenous peoples in Sweden as it is done now?
We could take this Kallak example. This process started more than 10 years ago, and actually the Sami villages concerned were not at all included in the first phase of the project, which they strongly protested against. Then the process went on, and the Sami villages opposed this mine all along the process to a mining permit, which was finally given by the Swedish government in 2022. But this decision was sharply criticized by the UN Committee for against Racial Discrimination, who's claimed that the Swedish permitting process and the decision of the government had not taken the free and prior informed consent, hadn't allowed this in the process. So they actually recommended that the Swedish government should and the Swedish parliament should change the legislation according to this. And this is not the first time that there has been criticism against the Swedish government in cases like this. Almost the same criticism came against the granting of a mining permit for the Rönnbäcken project. That was already 10 years ago that this permit was granted. There also the UN Committee Against Racial Discrimination said that the Sami village which was affected hadn't had the right to free and prior informed consent. So actually there has been some quite sharp criticism of the Swedish governments, at least, on this account.
Okay, so Arne, we see on one hand the development of mega mining in Sweden. We see also that the state is failing to ensure the respect of indigenous people's rights, particularly the free, prior, and informed consent, which is the safeguard per excellence to respect indigenous people's rights. What do you see when you think about securing raw materials for the European green transition from Swedish mining in the coming years, taking into account these observations?
Well, what we have seen over the last 10 to 15 years is the development of quite strong resistance against many new mining projects. This resistance comes from Sami organizations, but it also comes from environmental groups and from people living close to mines. And for example, we have seen this in this process for the Kallak mine. This is a picture from a blockade when there was a plan to make some test mining in this area, where the whole area was blockaded for a whole summer period, actually. And big police resources were called to this area to and make it possible to start this test mining. And after this, the protests against the Kallak project have continued over this whole 10-year period. So we see this in this case, but also in a lot of other cases where new mining projects are being proposed. So with this situation we see today, that we on the one hand have the plans from industry for a lot of new mines. This is supported by the present Swedish government, and on the other hand we see the resistance from Sami people, from reindeer herders, from environmental groups, and from people living in the area in general. I see the perspective of even growing and more sharper conflicts around mining over the coming period.
Thank you so much, Arne, for all this information. We really need to consider that Indigenous peoples and the free, prior, and informed consent, and not only Indigenous peoples, but as you mentioned, local communities and the neighboring residents in the areas have to be included. Thank you so much for your input.
Thank you.
That was the presentation of Arne. So we see the same reality in Sweden, the same reality in Brazil. And now we go directly to one very brave lady which accepted our invitation. Michelle Rivasi, welcome. Please, we ask to give us your reflections from the European Parliament on everything what has been said. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous et merci de cette invitation. Alors, j'ai entendu tous les intervenants et je vais vous donner un peu des informations concernant le Parlement européen et les lois européennes sur la réglementation sur les matières critiques. D'abord, je me présente, je m'appelle Michelle Rivasi, je suis députée verte. C'est mon 3e mandat. Et là, je suis coordinatrice à la commission développement. Alors, en ce qui concerne la commission développement, vous savez qu'on a donné un avis concernant cette réglementation sur les matières critiques parce que l'Europe se rend compte qu'il y a urgence à avoir une souveraineté européenne et surtout de ne pas dépendre de la Chine pour avoir accès à des matières premières. La deuxième chose, c'est qu'on est dans le Green Deal. Et le Green Deal, c'est la transition énergétique, c'est le développement du numérique. Et donc, ces deux voies demandent énormément de métaux, de terres rares, et même avec des technologies propres, eh bien, vous voyez que ces technologies propres, quand on parle des voitures électriques, de l'éolien, du solaire, ben, ça nécessite des métaux sales. Et ces métaux vont polluer en amont et en aval. Donc, lorsque j'entends parler de mines propres, ça n'existe pas. Il faut qu'on soit conscient que les mines propres n'existent pas. Donc, moi, je suis, pour la commission DEV, référente pour les peuples autochtones. Et c'est vrai que depuis cette législature, donc depuis 5 ans, on a essayé d'introduire dans tous les textes, justement, le consentement libre, préalable et éclairé des peuples autochtones concernant à la fois leurs terres, leur culture, et puis la reconnaissance que c'est par les peuples autochtones qu'il y aura une sauvegarde de la biodiversité. Or, le problème, et en tant que verte, je me sens directement impliquée puisqu'on est pour des technologies propres. On est pour une transition énergétique, on est plus ou moins pour le développement du numérique et on s'aperçoit qu'on est en panne, on n'a pas assez de mines en Europe et surtout, on ne veut pas trop les développer parce qu'il y a une opposition des populations. Et qu'est-ce qu'on va faire? Eh bien, on va aller en Afrique, comme on a toujours fait, on va aller en Amérique latine chercher ces métaux sales. Et d'où l'importance de la réglementation qui est portée par une députée Renew. Donc, c'est une Allemande qui s'appelle d'ailleurs Nicola Baer, qui est très libérale et qui fait en sorte à ce que le texte mentionne le fait d'informer et de consulter les populations autochtones sur le lieu où on va ouvrir, où on va exploiter cette mine, mais on n'a pas pu faire passer justement le consentement libre, préalable et éclairé, la référence avec la Convention 169 de l'Organisation internationale du travail, c'est-à-dire que tout ce qui était précis contraignant, pouvant aller jusqu'à une attaque en justice si ce n'est pas respecté, eh bien, le PPE, c'est-à-dire les conservateurs, ont refusé de le mettre dans le texte. Bien que la commission développement avait fourni un avis et on l'avait mis dans le texte. Donc, on voit bien qu'à l'heure actuelle, l'intérêt de l'Europe, c'est de continuer comme avant. Business as usual. Et c'est là où on a un gros problème, c'est qu'on est dans le cas de la croissance verte. C'est-à-dire, on veut consommer, alors on ajoute un peu de l'économie circulaire, etc., mais on veut toujours consommer et on n'est pas du tout dans une mentalité de réduire drastiquement notre consommation globale. Et ça pose un problème réel parce que automatiquement, on va chasser les populations autochtones parce que la Banque mondiale a montré que plus de 44% des mines sont dans les forêts où il y a justement ces peuples autochtones. Et on sait que les peuples autochtones, justement, comme on parle beaucoup de climat et de biodiversité, étaient les conservateurs de la biodiversité. Donc, il faut qu'on continue à se bagarrer. Alors, sur le texte, il a été voté par le Parlement européen le 14 septembre. Il y a les trilogues qui ont commencé. Le premier a eu lieu le 20 septembre et la Commission espère l'adoption du texte avant la fin de la mandature. Mais ce n'est pas évident qu'on arrive à ce niveau-là. Deuxième chose que je voulais vous dire, sur lequel nous, on a beaucoup insisté, c'est que tout ce qui est accord de libre-échange, que ce soit les accords de partenariat économique en Afrique, que ce soit les accords bilatéraux ou multilatéraux, on veut réduire les taxes à l'exportation des matières premières. Et nous, les Verts, on est défavorables à ça. Nous, on dit les taxes à l'exportation sur les matières premières, et ça, on peut le faire dans le cadre de l'OMC, eh bien, ça permet… Je finis. Ça permet justement le développement du pays et que pour nous, c'est un élément important. Et l'autre élément sur lequel on est hyper attaché, c'est les droits de l'homme, c'est les droits justement des peuples autochtones. Il faut qu'ils soient informés avant d'accepter ou pas, avant de participer ou pas à l'exploitation des mines. Mais sachez quand même que ça remet en question notre modèle de développement. Voilà ce que je voulais vous dire par rapport à toutes les interventions et je vous remercie d'être…
Michelle, merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
Very much. Gracias, muchas gracias. Your words are really strong, and I hope it's going to give some light to your colleagues at the European Parliament and in the dialogues of the trilogues. We are very confident that the arguments we have brought are strong enough, and as you said, we need to advance. I'm going to be mindful of the time. I'm going to thank you once again, Michelle, for being here with us. And I'm going to give the word directly to Robin Rules, because we believe we advocate, as you do, on stakeholder participation, meaningful stakeholder and rights holders participation. And I go directly to Robin Rules for this, who is the coordinator of the recently launched Raw Materials Coalition. Robin, the floor is yours. Please give us your thoughts about what is the situation of raw materials in Europe and why should Indigenous peoples be included, and what are your asks actually for the European policymakers? Robin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Evelyn. Surely a handful, but I think we have already heard quite a lot of interesting insights combined within this webinar that really pinpoint to the importance of free, prior and informed consent, abiding by Indigenous rights within the context of the energy transition, and the rising demand for, well, so-called critical raw materials. So the Raw Materials Coalition is a project that started off about the middle of last year. In May, we were getting reports that there was upcoming legislation from the European Union to work around the issue of the material demands for the energy transition. And we quickly realized that it was very important for civil society to organize around this subject, as it touches upon many important aspects, from human rights to indigenous peoples' rights to corporate accountability to sustainable patterns of consumption to circularity to climate change, etc., which overspans, of course, also a lot of civil society, and it is a very, very broad but also very uniting topic to work on. So when we realized last year that this was becoming more and more something that increasingly was looked at by policymakers, we decided to organize ourselves in the form of a coalition. We originally started off with about 7 members, and as of now, as of October 2023, we are happy to mention that we are at by now already 48 members. For this, I can also refer you to the members list, which you can find on our coalition website, which I have just posted in the chat, which is eurmc.org. So what do we do specifically, and why did we organize ourselves again? So we've crafted a vision around which we work as a coalition, specifically to kind of foster public awareness, to foster a particular narrative for a just and inclusive, social and environmentally just green transition. And we also work specifically on the upcoming EU legislation, of which, of course, as mentioned before, the EU Critical Raw Materials Act is the most pressing and most prevalent file at the moment. So why specifically, how are we working on these topics? I think, well, one of the central pieces is already mentioned quite a lot. It's about what are the effects on the ground of these extractive industries, but also further up the supply chain, the refining, the processing, the recycling of these big industries, and what are the impacts on the ground, both here in the European Union, where the European Union wants to boost its capacity for extraction, but also in third countries by which the European Union aims to start new strategic partnerships. For this, it's very important to take into consideration how the European Union is engaging with these groups, both on a member state level, but also on the EU level, and what are the instruments that are already in place or that already exist, and how can we translate this indeed, as was mentioned before, also in one of the other by one of the other speakers, from soft commitments to strong commitments, because they are they should not be seen as obstructions to just green transitions, but enablers. What are other demands that we have beyond these? One is also civil society and community involvement in the crafting of strategic partnerships. This is often now a very, what can be considered a very obscure process in which the European Union engages with third countries to craft these partnerships, but often there is very little public and citizen involvement within these processes. And then, of course, I think one of the most important things also to look here in the European Union and to look ourselves in the mirror is consumption patterns. And I think it's very good, also very happy to hear from MEP Rivasi around the need to talk about also reduction. So this is one of our main and core messages also with the Raw Materials Coalition, that we need to look into reduction strategies combined with circularity, combined with upscaling, recycling, as the only way to really ensure that a transition towards clean and green energy and sustainable consumption of energy and resources requires us to investigate on how we can mitigate our consumption to the extent as much as possible. This not only to remain within planetary boundaries, of which climate change is one of the most pressing one, but only 1 out of 9, and land use, water use, geochemical processes, but also biodiversity are other ones that are being put under pressure by increased material extraction, but also from a distributional perspective, when we look at how what are we digging up and how are we going to consume these resources to supply for our energy grid, not only within the European Union, but also in many of the other countries that we also consider our partners, but are also, on a global scale, to what extent this is feasible to ensure that this switch to green energy is also something that happens on a global scale. And then also what we advocate for is for civil society organizations to be more involved within this process, not only within the legislative process, but also in the decision making that the European Union will be doing to its Critical Raw Materials Board, etc. And maybe as a last point, also the provision of access to information and access to justice, which is a very important provision under the Aarhus Convention, that this is abided by so that people are informed and that they have access to the appropriate legal instruments. And I think this also really indicates the need for free, prior and informed consent as a method, as a way to ensure that people are not being left behind on this energy transition and that they have a fair say within the process, or whether or not to go about certain projects, and if so, under what conditions. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. We have started this event by asking how can the European Union secure the supply of minerals for its twin transition by including rights holders and ensuring the respect for indigenous rights. I think the answer is very clear. It's by bringing meaningfully indigenous peoples at the table and including their rights are fully respected in the emerging European legislation. I don't have anything to add. You have said it all. Thank you so much for all the speakers. Thank you so much for the attendance and your attention. This event was co-organized by the Raw Material Coalition, Synergy Coalition, People's Forest Peoples Programs and Cultural Survival. And in the name of all organizers, I want to thank our tremendous speakers panel. I also want to thank our interpreters and our communications colleagues. And thank you all for your attention. Have a nice day. And let's keep up the conversation and bring the indigenous people's rights to its right position. Thank you all.